Hi guys, okay, so I decided to make a YouTube video on explaining the OSI model. For those of you who don't know what the OSI model means, it actually is the Open Systems Interconnection Model, and it's very popular in terms of computer science and network architecture. So I wanted to explain this. I would try to explain it as simple as possible. You could get much more details if you go to like a Wikipedia, if you go to the Wikipedia website and search for the OSI model. But essentially, the OSI model explains how data is transferred between networks, and it really explains all the different processes involved in network architecture. Now, how I learned the OSI layer was actually on a more simplistic level, because I guess our teacher thought that it was really hard to remember 7 layers. So when we learned it as actually 5 layers. So I'll call the layers out and how we learned it, and I'll compare it to the OSI model and the 7 layers. Essentially, how we learned it was there were 5 layers. There's the physical layer, the data link layer, the network layer, the transport layer, and then there's the application layer. Now, the OSI model breaks this down a little bit further. So instead of 5, like we learned it as 5 layers, it's actually 7 layers. So counting it back again, it's the physical layer, the data link layer, number 2, 3, network layer, 4, transport layer, 5, session layer, 6, presentation layer, and 7, application layer. Now, essentially the reason why we broke it down into just 5 layers is because the 5th layer, the application layer, is what we consider to do all 3, the application, presentation, and session layer. And I'll get into a little bit more detail in terms of that later on, but let's start with the physical layer. So essentially there's the layer 1. This is the bottommost layer, and this is the physical layer. Essentially, to bring it down to a practical level, when you connect a network cable from your computer into a switch, you initially start at layer 1 and move up. So layer 1 is the physical layer. That is the electrical impulses that pass through the cable and connects the switch to the computer. So think of it as just the electrical impulses, right? It is, I mean, it's a lot more detail if you read about it, but that is essentially what it does. The more important layer, as I would say, is starting from layer 2. Layer 2 is the data link layer. I like to remember it as the MAC address layer. So this is the layer in which the switch is able to recognize a computer or a network card by its MAC address. For those of you who don't know, the MAC addresses are not the IP addresses. Don't get them confused. The MAC addresses is at layer 2. Now at layer 3, which is the network layer, this functions as this is the layer for routing. So this is, I believe, what they consider to be the IP layer. Yes, I'm correct. It's the IP layer. Now this is the layer where you would typically see 192.168.1.0, which is a typical internal LAN network IP address. So layer 3 is essentially an IP layer. Now up to layer 3, some switches and routers are able to, all routers could go to layer 3. But some switches are able to reach layer 3. So generally speaking, a quote-unquote dumb switch only understands up to the layer 2, which is the MAC address layer. In other words, it just understands when you plug in, there's a MAC address to forward the packets to. But some switches actually do routing as well. So routing is done on the IP layer, which is the layer 3. And another tutorial, I'll explain a little bit more about routing, especially because routing is such a technical topic to talk about. But I like to simplify everything that I do to make it easier for myself. Okay, so we were talking about the layer 3. We reached the layer 3, which is the IP layer. Then there's layer 4, which is the transport layer. Now this is a very popular layer as well for most programmers, because this is the TCP layer and, well, of course, the UDP layer. Now the TCP layer, which is the transport layer, allows information to be transferred in such a way that, the TCP, that is, the TCP protocol, allows that information to be transferred reliably. So for example, on the layer 3, which was just the IP layer, you could send data from one computer to the next, but there's no guarantee that the receiving side has actually received the data. You just know that you sent it to them. On the transport layer, which is based on protocols. The protocols guarantee that when you send something from one computer to another computer, that the other computer is able to reliably access it, receive it. So if, for example, my computer was sending a message to computer number 2, it would essentially mean that it would send the information, and then the computer 2 would have to answer back in such a way that computer 1 confirms that it was received. And if it has not confirmed that it was, the computer 1 will go back again and resend it. So that is essentially what the layer 4 is. The transport layer, that's what we mean. Layer 5, as I said, in the OSI model, there are 3 more layers. There's layer 5, layer 6, and layer 7. Layer 5 is the session layer, layer 6 is the presentation layer, and layer 7 is the application layer. Essentially, it's hard to go into a lot of details in terms of session, but I would say I just call it layer 5. So layer 5 is, let's say, session layer, presentation layer, and application layer. That's just one layer for me. That's how I consider it, and that's the application layer. And I like to think about it in terms of like PHP, because PHP can do a session layer, and what a session layer essentially is that the application can recognize you, the user, as a unique individual client, and that is at the application level. So that is at the programming level, and that is essentially what the session layer is. The presentation layer, obviously, to present whatever is being to show what data is being sent. And then, of course, the application layer, which is the closest to the end user. And that is essentially what the OSI model really is. So don't make it hard. I mean, this may not make it past your exams. You'll have to go into more detail. I would suggest that you go to Wikipedia and read up more about the OSI layer. It's important to understand it as well, because when you have to do networking and switching, you'll have to understand the difference between, peer-to-peer routing through routers to get to different networks, and essentially this will make you a better IT technician or IT network administrator, because you will understand how data moves, and from this you could probably be able to troubleshoot where issues may be coming from, in terms of if it's an application problem or if it's a network problem. Thanks again for viewing this video, and please subscribe to my channel, and I'll catch you soon, where I'll probably explain routing in the layman's terms. Thanks again. Bye.